Hello everybody, welcome back. This is of course the second of our two videos. We're trying to pin down the question, what is international social work? And the question is not a stupid question. You've got book titles like this, Understanding International Social Work, suggesting that we have a clear concept here. In our last presentation, we noted we don't. You know, international social work effectively means whatever the author in question wants it to mean. But it is still good if we pursue our task of trying to be as concrete as possible as to what international social work might mean. And I think a big contribution to this discourse was in this book here, Healy's text. I've got the 2008 edition, but it came originally in 2001. Healy considered this. She tried to pin it down, tried to be very, very precise. She came up with 4 distinct possible meanings of the term. Her first, internationally related domestic practice and advocacy. Advocacy just means representing somebody's interests, helping their voice be heard. But the word domestic practice is maybe the more important one to explain. Domestic can mean at home. Here it means in my home country. So think about you, maybe you're trained in Fechter, maybe you're working in an agency near Fechter, you know, you're not really doing international work, and yet you have a client who's a migrant, okay? So that immediately gives our work an international dimension. In fact, this, you know, it's very much the nature of our social work today. Much of our work has some kind of direct or indirect link to internationality, to migration or international questions. So there you are, that first category is potentially quite a large one. A second category, professional exchange. This starts the minute you open a book published outside of your home country, Germany. The minute you open an Anglo-Saxon book and start learning about Anglo-Saxon perspectives on your social work or your social work management, that's where professional exchange starts. And of course, it can be exciting. You can go to conferences. As a student, you may have guest lecturers, your lecturers inviting a friend to give you a talk. You yourself may be spending 5 months overseas, an Erasmus Plus placement in a partner university. You know, I have a passion for getting you to consider such ideas. So 2 is exchange. 3, international practice. In that North American sense, international means outside of your own country. But Healy means it in a more concrete sense. She's particularly thinking about a global North practitioner working in a global South setting. Maybe this is alluded to with the cover of her book, which we discussed in our last video. You've got the setting of maybe an African country here. Think of maybe an international NGO doing some kind of development aid, working in social development in a global South country, and social work in that setting. Presumably it's a kind of developmental social work, also working with social development aims and goals. That's her third category. The final category, more at the macro level, she notes that social workers sometimes have a consulting role with big organizations, international aid organizations, or even the United Nations. And then she's thinking about international policy development and advocacy. So that's her typology. I think it's well worth holding on to. On the other hand, I don't want to suggest that this is a complete and extensive list. Other authors consider such lists, such typologies. Maybe they'll add additional meanings, and maybe it's worth me just outlining a few of these right here. We can talk about the internationalization of degree programs. This talk is an example of this. I teach in Fechter, I teach in programs such as social work or social work management. And these programs traditionally have a local focus, and yet universities today are expected to give a European or an even international dimension in their teaching. So my courses in the English language are a nice way of realizing that. You even get international degrees, which are wonderful. You can get joint degrees. I love teaching in Stavanger in Norway. My students there are master students in an Erasmus Mundus project, a really beautiful concept. But before I see them, they've spent a semester in Lisbon, I think, in Portugal. Then they go to Sweden after I see them. So they're investigating social work ideas from 3 different European countries. How beautiful is that? Another category that we can talk about here, we've mentioned this idea of domestic practice having an international component. For example, migrants. What about transnational families? So a family whose life somehow crosses a border. Maybe our family lives in Aachen in Germany, but maybe the parents work in Belgium. The kids maybe go to school in one of those two countries. What about if that family then breaks up? So you'd have a kind of transnational child family support, child protection question there maybe. What about the case of inter-country adoption? Quite common in today's world, of course. Completely different meaning. What about international standards? What about international codes of ethics? I introduced the global definition of social work. Practitioners, experts coming together, thinking collectively about social work questions. And that's one of a series of ongoing projects. And again, that was followed by investigations of ethical questions. You know, could we have an international social work code of ethics? Something that the experts tried to put together. And this again is an ongoing project to try and think internationally and help our profession to develop internationally. We've got international projects, we've got international cooperations between various agencies. So as you can see, you know, the more we add to this list, the more potential meanings of international social work we can come up with. Maybe it's nice if I close this presentation by spending a few moments to introduce an international social work agency. And if I were to pick one, which I find really interesting, I think it might be the International Social Service. It's an international NGO. In the literature, you might see INGO written in capitals. It's got a great website where you can get a feeling for what it does. They define themselves quite nicely. The International Social Service helps individuals, children and families confronted with social problems involving 2 or more countries as a consequence of international migration or displacement. Actually, their work is much more than that. This quote here, crossing borders in support of children and families, is maybe a nicer description of what they do. It's their slogan. The website lists and details the organization's fields of practice, categorizing them. In a minute, I'm going to show you that list. I think they've got something like 6. But first, pause here, scratch your head, natter with your partner. In your fantasies, in your expectations, what might this organization do? Can you guess any of the bullet points on their lists of typical activity? Pause here. What did you come up with? Their website notes they do inter-country casework. Maybe a nice example of that would be my Aachen, Belgium family that I discussed a few moments ago. A family crossing borders, you know, the life or the work crosses borders, some kind of difficulties within that family. We clearly have a need for cross-border coordination there. Children deprived of their family, I think in the terminology of the ISS, this would be what we call looked after children or children in care, children with foster families, children in children's homes. Advocacy, I've used this word before. Advocacy is if I represent your interests. So they try to represent the interests of people that don't really have a clear voice, or people who are enabled to have a clear voice. Another area of work, children born through surrogacy. So this whole field of birth, reproduction, assistance, obviously leading to a whole bunch of legal questions and practical questions. They help work with that. International family mediation. And the final category, children with disabilities in institutional care. Institutional care meaning homes and places like this. And the organization notes that in the international perspective, lots of disabled children don't have the chance to grow up in their birth family. They're forced to end up in institutional care, and the organization ISS works to try and prevent that. Once again, there's a whole bunch of really interesting books out there. I gave you a series of covers in my last presentation, and I've been using Healy's a lot, which really is a great starting point. Hope you've enjoyed this talk. Thanks for listening, everybody.